Hey there. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Tyler Hakes. I'm the principal and strategy director at Optimist. We're a growth-focused content marketing agency. And today we are resuming our live Q&A sessions with a really exciting session. We've got Paul Perry joining us. He actually previously worked with us at Optimist, and now he runs a content marketing agency called Literal Humans. So we're going to be talking to him about working with nonprofits and mission-driven organizations. But before we get started, I just want to go through a couple quick reminders. First of all, if you're not already a member, please check out our community. It's focused on content marketing and SEO. It's called Top of the Funnel. In the last week, we've had some Slack AMA sessions. We've shared video teardowns. We've hosted live sessions like this. Just tons of great content. So if you're, in-house freelance agency, content marketer or SEO person, we'd love to have you. You can check it out. It's at yesoptimist.com/tofu, TOFU. It's a free Slack channel. You can join anytime. And then one more quick thing. I just want to say, please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you have not already. We have workshops and Q&As like this that we'll be hosting regularly in the coming months. And we've got tons of exciting content and lots of interesting guests that will be joining us. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button and get updates anytime we are scheduling these sessions. Awesome. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guest, Paul Perry.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Paul. How's it going?
Good. Good to see you again, man.
Yeah, likewise. You were saying earlier it's actually sunny in London, huh?
It's a rare sunny afternoon in London. Yeah, I'm going to scoot out of here as soon as we're done chatting. So
that's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about what you're working on with Literal Humans, and also kind of dig into some of the lessons and things that you've learned throughout your career working with mission-driven organizations and nonprofits and all that good stuff. I think this is a space that's really interesting to me, and I think a lot of other folks who kind of come from more of a kind of traditional business background. It's definitely something that I think a lot of people, when they get into this work and they realize that it might be more fulfilling for them to pursue working with sort of more mission-driven or kind of nonprofit type organizations. So really excited to dig into that. Let's just start at the very beginning. Can you just give everyone kind of a quick rundown on your background and your experience working with these kind of organizations?
Yeah, sure. So, I started my career as a teacher, and was working in Southwest Philadelphia, teaching middle school English and social studies to 8th graders. I think that really grounded me. And, when you're a teacher, you just see all these different systems that are not working for kids and families. And that's sort of just coming in your classroom every single day. So that was, I think, a really powerful, foundational experience for me work-wise. And then, from there, I went on to work with a couple different education nonprofits, one that was focused on youth with LGBTQ parents, one that was focused on youth who were caught up in the criminal legal system. And then did some work in districts, worked for the largest school district in the US, the New York City Department of Education, worked on some new school design launch plans with them. And then, kind of in 2016 pivoted into digital marketing. So some of my first clients were, I would argue, they're mission-driven brands. So TransferWise, they're looking to sort of like, pull the veil off of the banking system and drive down rates for folks. And then TopTal, they're doing some interesting stuff with freelancers and building a better freelance market. So those were pretty foundational work experiences there.
Yeah. Was your work with those organizations like the nonprofits and stuff, was it focused on marketing, or kind of what was your role in those organizations?
Yeah, it was programmatic for the most part, but I would say I was the executive director of a couple organizations, but definitely in that role touched on marketing, touched on different parts of the organization, but had to be sort of a public face for those organizations. With the Department of Ed in New York City, it was interesting that we were doing a lot of community engagement, which I think involves a bit of marketing. So working with students directly and engaging them with different pieces of content and materials. Same with parents, same with community groups, even down to the level of like, hey, we're launching this new school. Here's a flyer, and like, here's how you get your kids signed up. So like really, meat and potatoes on the ground marketing stuff there. I remember one of the, okay.
I was just saying, I think it's super interesting to me. Like, I think anyone involved, almost anyone involved in like a nonprofit role has to be kind of a marketer to some extent. Because I think like that's most nonprofits, especially, there's like the work that you're doing, but you also have to like sell it. Like you have to sell the impact that you're having and like raise money and like do all this stuff, that a lot of organizations don't necessarily have to have to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a particular day when I was running, it's called the Reset Foundation, and it was a nonprofit for young men in the justice system. And, I think this particular day I like met with a district attorney and was like basically trying to convince her not to put some guys in jail and to, send them to our program. And then I had like a panel at Google, and then I had like a meeting with teachers to like kind of like, recruit them for the program and stuff like that. And I remember thinking to myself at the end of that day, like, wow, this is a lot of marketing to like very different groups, in one day. So a lot of hustle there.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like so you kind of really got pulled more in this direction kind of through your experience in the education system. Is that kind of the path that you feel like really set you in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it started earlier than that, though. I mean, I'm a Black biracial kid who grew up in '80s and '90s in America, and I had gay parents. I have family members who struggle with addiction and poverty. So I think that gave me like a really strong sense of like justice and equity, and it was just kind of written into my DNA to kind of get into that work. So I did it as long as I could until I got a little burned out with it and wanted to write more and be creative and travel more. But I guess I just have this like odd chemical imbalance that doctors call giving a shit, which is one of Optimist's values. And I think that's Latin. But I just, I believe that like my own progress and privilege, means quite little if I'm not sharing that with others and supporting, empowering others. So
yes, that's powerful. I'd love to maybe dig in a little bit to some specific experience that you had that you've had, I guess, in working with these organizations, and maybe sharing something that's been particularly meaningful for you, or something that you felt a lot of fulfillment in doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, the time I spent in New York City, I think, was probably one of the most profound professional development experiences of my life. A couple levels. One was just, a lot of the work we did, we were designing new schools, and we were actually engaging, current high school students at that time to help us design, what the program of the school would be like. So we would sit in our co-working space and build this like amazing thing, and then take it out to the streets and go to, automotive high school in Queens, ride the 7 train out there. And we'd show up and the kids would just be like, this is shit. This is terrible. You know what I mean? From a marketing perspective, it just doesn't sound cool to kids, but also from like a pedagogical perspective, it maybe won't be effective, and this is straight from the clients themselves. So that was a real like lesson to, in terms of like how you market things and how you message them. And I'd say the second level was just like a results level. I think the moment that sticks out to me the most was I went back to one of the schools like a year later after I had launched, and we were like sitting in a, an auditorium gym, and the kids were doing like one of their morning circles, and maybe about 80 of them. And the principal had each kid come up to me and say, one thing that they loved about the school. And by like the third kid, I was just like weeping. I was just, done. Like, cause it was so powerful. It was like, I helped design a school that like changed a kid's life and hopefully generations of kids. And like, to me, that's just, and you don't typically get that kind of gratification as an educator. So that was really powerful.
For sure. Yeah, well, that's amazing. That's really, really great. Cool. Well, I want to pivot a little bit away from kind of the work that you've done in the past to talking a little bit more about kind of where you're heading now with the new company. I guess let's just start kind of at the beginning. I guess when you're talking to potential clients or kind of thinking about the work that you're doing or going to be doing with a mission-driven organization and nonprofit, et cetera, like what are those discussions like? What kind of help are you ultimately providing, or what kind of services are you providing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we start out with like really trying to drill down to like what are the business organizational goals that the company is hoping to achieve. So is it brand awareness in a general sense? Is it more funding or donors if we're looking at a nonprofit? Are they looking to reach more people who could benefit from the content itself that they're hoping to hire us on for? So I think one of Optimist clients, Fair Shake, is a good example of that. Like the things we write actually help consumers be better protected and supported there. So we start from that, and then we do a bit of a landscape analysis and look at the competition, read all of their stuff, check the SERPs, the search engine results, and look at Ahrefs, and then kind of backwards plan a content strategy, from there. A lot of this I learned from you, so thank you. I think that, and really try to show the client how that helps them move towards their goals. And I'm sure we'll get to this a bit, but like it can be a little bit different in the nonprofit mission-driven space. You kind of have to, fudge with those goals a bit. But
yeah. So I guess maybe just take that like one step further. So how do you think about like aligning, like the literal work with those goals that you talked about, kind of starting with?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is like really sitting down with the client and agreeing on those, what the KPIs are, what the metrics are for, what success looks like for them. So for some of our clients, they actually just do want to reach more people. And a lot of times they throw around the phrase like thought leadership, and we want to be a thought leader. We want to, have a bigger presence in the education research space. And I'm kind of like, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of numbers? Like, how do we drill down from there? So I think norming on that is really important to sort of build your data dashboard with clients. So that's typically where we start. I think aligning on outputs is really important too. Like a lot of times for nonprofit mission-driven brands, sometimes it's just production. Maybe they've hired someone, but the production has faltered for some reason, and they just want to see regular content going, messaging their brand and their mission. So sort of aligning on that. And then just like looping back and saying, all right, we've got agreement on this strategy. How's it performing this month? Looking at that dashboard with them on a regular basis. And sometimes I think inserting new data points in there and saying like, oh, actually, this is something we hadn't thought about before. Maybe we should launch a lean referral program because that's going to bring in, more subscribers or what have you. So being flexible there, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's interesting. And how do you think about kind of the scope of work that your firm is able to provide?
Yeah, it can really vary from client to client. So we try to keep it flexible. We operate a similar model, as Optimist does in terms of being a network of freelancers. And so, for example, we're chatting with a potential client that's looking for some architectural renderings. So we're looking at bringing in partners that specialize in that and integrating them into our team, and basically providing that scope for clients because they do appreciate more of a one-stop shop. So that's kind of fun. You get to learn about new aspects of the industry that are adjacent to what you do, but not necessarily your core work. So that's important. And I think part of it's just like building a team that's like very flexible and adaptable and oh, I know someone who can do renderings. Like, okay, I didn't. So great. I'm glad. Thank you. So stuff like that.
That's awesome. Yeah. I like the point that you made before, which I think is something that definitely carries over. Really any kind of client work is like, I feel like the most important step early on is really taking the big picture that the client has in mind. So as you said, they might, depending on kind of what they've been reading or what they've been hearing, they might come to you and say something broad, like we want to be a thought leader. And then really translating that into something actionable. So what does that mean? How do we measure that? And then that's going to sort of define like, how can you actually execute against measurement?
And sometimes I think it involves like not quite disagreeing, but I'll say amending, some of the initial stated client goals where, we've had like one where it's like, yeah, we're just going to increase social media followership by 500% in the next like quarter. And we're like, okay, so, and then it's like, all right, let's drill down and actually look at like how many LinkedIn followers do you have? What's your LinkedIn strategy to grow that? Like, who are you targeting on LinkedIn and why? And how does that feed into your business goals? Like really just digging in with them and helping them build better, I think, metrics and KPIs. So.
Yeah, totally. It's funny you've mentioned that specific example. I was just having a call with another friend of mine who runs an agency, and he was saying that they got hired at one point to like, I think it was something like 5x the clients like LinkedIn followers or like whatever. But they were like asking like why are we doing this? And they were like, well, the CEO said that's the goal.
Right.
That was the extent of the strategy.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting, I think, like account-based management stuff there, because maybe you're typically dealing with like a CMO or a VP of marketing or a communications person at our level. Sometimes the CEO is on board, sometimes not, but you can really see the internal politics playing out there. So, yeah,
sure.
Navigating that.
Actually, I think that's a great segue into my next question, which is, given kind of your experience working on sort of the other side of the table, or like quote unquote client side, like what do you feel like you have any particular insights or skills at maybe navigating some of the internal operations or politics that go on there?
Oof, how much time do you have? A couple of things that we run into. One is paying attention to dynamics on the board of directors, and if it's a nonprofit, a lot of times. So we've had a few instances already in just a few months where the board's changed their priority or funding decisions or things like that, or what they're allocating. And so I think just there's not much you can do about that, but just knowing that like the people who work in the organization are a party to that, and being flexible in that sense is important. Watch out for CEOs who are shifting things, and I think that applies both nonprofit and for-profit. Shifting priorities and be nimble with that. Another thing I'd say is, go ahead.
I was going to say, what kind of advice would you give for someone who wants to work with nonprofits about kind of how to navigate that reality that the board directors might meet and come back and everything has changed?
I think it helps to one, just like know that that context, that's happening. Because I think if you're used to working on the for-profit side and that's not an issue, then you'll be caught by surprise if you don't understand that that's a dynamic. Two, I think maybe build it into your sales cycle and your process and say, okay, this person is on board that I'm going to be working with, but like, is the CEO on board? Has the board released the funds? Like, all that stuff. There's a couple other layers there as well. So, another thing to think about too is like how nonprofits spend. Sometimes they're not always necessarily thinking quarterly. Sometimes they're trying to maybe spend down a grant fund by the end of the year, or they've got a deadline from a funder that's wants a specific thing that they're trying to meet. So there's a couple other added layers and angles there. So
that's super interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely like a whole new world. I can say just specifically from me, not having experience working with nonprofits, like thinking about funding and stuff differently. We think about our client budget as it's generally like we have $1 million to spend on marketing this year or whatever, and whatever we're our fees are just kind of coming out of that bag. Whereas I think in the nonprofit world, a lot of times it's more earmarked or kind of allocated for specific uses and things like that.
Yeah, and I think there's like also like a trust building aspect too, right? I think this may be changing, but I think there's a tendency with mission driven organizations and nonprofits specifically to be a bit more traditional and not as remote oriented. They typically want to hire a person rather than a globally distributed team of freelancers. Like that's kind of like not quite their language always, because their work is so on the ground. It's with people. It's delivering direct services. But I think that's changing a bit, and they're more open to it these days. So that's a hopeful point.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, by the way, I know I cut you off previously. Did you have something else that you wanted to share there on that point about kind of insights from being on the other side?
I think just the last piece is like just that there's a bit of an education piece there. So be prepared to maybe work a little bit harder to kind of educate folks at mission-driven brands and nonprofits specifically, and really show them that through line between content strategy and achieving their business goals. Because I think sometimes the KPIs in mission-driven orgs they may be vague, they're non-existent, but they're still there, and they're business goals, that relate to their larger organizational goals. So you kind of, I've had a few times where I've had to like really dig in and think about a proposal and really give it a little bit more love than I would a traditional proposal for, say, a tech company. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe can you give us like a flavor of like what are some of the high level goals that clients come into the conversation with?
Yeah, I think high level, like, more brand awareness, greater numbers of followers, community members, readers, more donors, which is an interesting one in terms of tailoring content for high net worth individuals or like program officers, say, at a foundation, which I think is a helpful feature of nonprofits, where you can get really highly targeted. You can serve up ads to the 50 top program officers at foundations and, write specific content and drop it into the program officers group in LinkedIn or something like that. So in a way that's more helpful. More clients, however they define it, actually reaching people who, are being served by the organization as well. It can be vague sometimes for nonprofits who don't speak the language of KPIs and business metrics and stuff, but again, they're there, and I think it's just like having that conversation and agreeing on them.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's really kind of on both sides of the organization, I guess, in terms of like the fundraising piece or kind of the operational side, but also like the actual work that they're doing and like using content and the work that you guys do as a way to actually like enact the mission.
Mm-hmm. Yep, totally.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. So maybe one of the things that you touched on was kind of this idea of like, sort of like getting the buy-in and kind of the various stakeholders that are involved in say a nonprofit, for instance. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe like your process of stepping through, the buy-in process, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd say at the highest level, like, work to build a strong relationship with your point of contact, at the organization. So I think typically what we find is like that person is an easy enough, I wouldn't say an easy, but easy enough sell that they get the content strategy would be helpful to their organization. Maybe they've been referred to you, and so they trust you based on that referral. And so talking to them and saying, okay, we're clicking. All right, let's talk to the C-suite. Let's talk to the board. Let's talk to some of your other comms team who, are going to be connected and part of the strategy. I think it's important to include their ideas in the strategy, but at the same time also kind of like lead them to water and bring in some stuff that maybe doesn't feel as familiar to them, but is going to be effective from a strategy standpoint. I think it's important to show examples of past strategy wins, especially in this space. So like case studies are really valuable for folks in this space because they want to see, they're not like swimming in examples of nonprofits and mission-driven organizations using content strategy to great effect. So you kind of have to deliver that for them as well. So embedding that in your proposal, having that on your site, and talking them through that in the proposal process, I think is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Great. And do you find that usually you're the one kind of having those conversations like up the ladder, so to speak, or is it something that you're working with your point of contact and they're kind of discussing it internally? How does that usually unfold? Yeah,
it varies. I think predominantly it's the point of contact who's doing that, and you're doing your utmost to give them everything they need. So, I mean, we just closed a client that like it was like the third go round on the proposal, and then I just kept amending it and having great conversations with them, and so that felt good to finally close, but it was a lot of work, and maybe more work than would have been the case if it was like a tech company, for example. So yeah, there's that, and then a few times I'd say, they'll bring someone else onto the call, and there's like another stakeholder you got to sell, and that's fine. You do your thing, and try to get as much intel about where that person's coming from and what their outlook on things is ahead of time, and maybe sell it a bit differently, but be aware of that.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Do you feel like, or do you find that there are generally more people involved in I guess the buy-in process or the sign-off process on like with a nonprofit, for instance, versus like a tech company?
Yeah, I mean, loosely, I would say so. And I think that becomes an interesting thing. I think you have to. I mean, we always like sort of debated about this at Optimist, like just how rigorous are you with, hey, we're gonna have one point of contact and one round of edits, and like kind of, there's a bit of client management in there. So in the sales process, I think you're gentler about that and more open to fielding, lots of different stakeholders. And then when you get into, the work, I think building those boundaries, I'd say healthy boundaries are really important, as you well know.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. I think we're going to get into kind of how other people can kind of maybe think about getting into this work or working with these types of organizations. But I think like that's an interesting and valuable lesson there, is just understanding kind of the hierarchy and kind of how to navigate those waters, which it sounds like are likely to be different from other types of clients. I think like that's half the battle, right? It's just like knowing that going in, that there's going to be more people involved. I'm going to have to sell this to this person, that person, and that person, etc. Kind of preparing yourself and maybe amending your process.
And I think asking ahead of time too, about what that landscape looks like maybe on the first call, like, all right, who's all on board here? Who do we need to sell, and get on with this this contract, basically. Because I think you might not instinctively ask that with like, your traditional tech firm. So.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a place where we've been pretty fortunate with Optimist, is that a lot of our clients are fairly small startups. They're not, they don't have huge teams. There's not a lot of bureaucracy that happens, and so usually it's like, if our point of contact has the budget and believes in what we're offering, then like they can usually pull the trigger on it, versus like having to sell it to a bunch of different stakeholders. and
Right.
I think I guess in that sense that it's probably much more similar to maybe like working with larger companies or like an enterprise or something, where there might be layers of people who have to kind of sign off on stuff and approve everything.
Right.
Yeah. How do you kind of plug into the team at these organizations when you're working with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part's not too dissimilar from the model and working with like B2B SaaS companies. Like, you link your systems, Slack, your Asana, your Drive. Build your quarterly calendar, make it transparent to to the client. Try to just generally keep up communications through the various channels so they understand how the strategy is playing out and how the execution is rolling out. We've had a couple of interesting things where, maybe a bit different on the or the mission driven side is, they'll ask you to do like a training, for example, of their staff on content strategy that maybe wouldn't necessarily happen on the tech side. We've had to like give reports to boards of directors, which is really interesting about our progress. That's a bit different than you would see on the B2B SaaS side. Trying to think if there are other major differences there, but yeah, I think it just more of maybe a bit more of the communication and the ongoing, like, oh, what is this SEO thing that maybe I didn't know about? Whereas on the B2B SaaS side, like that's what they live and breathe. So I think that ongoing education is important. And usually folks are great about it. They're like, I have no idea what that word is you just said. Can you please explain it to me? And then you explain it and they're like, cool, keep going. So yeah.
Do you find that you like on kind of a day-to-day basis also like interface with more people on the client side?
Yeah, it varies from client to client. It depends, but I would say like on average compared to B2B SaaS, yes, but not in a way that's like burdensome. I'd say it's like, maybe two people who are on the comms team instead of the one person, or, maybe they have like a contract, copywriter or designer or something like that. So,
yeah.
So.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. So I want to talk a little bit more about kind of maybe the specifics of the work that you're doing, maybe like versus the work that we've done together at Optimist, and kind of how you have aligned or realigned some of those some of the specific deliverables and strategy and that kind of stuff with the needs of these mission driven clients. So I guess maybe let's like the best place to start there is like, do you feel like there's any sort of major difference in terms of like the deliverables or like the actual work that you're doing as I guess with respect to kind of content marketing, content strategy stuff specifically, since obviously we don't do renderings and architecture and some of those things.
Yeah, in some cases, I guess some things that have been a bit newer to me that we've encountered are like maybe deeper levels of like audits when you start out, so like, helping brands understand because I think maybe they're starting from a place where they're not as savvy about, what their web or social presence is, or just, how their content is so far. So we've been asked to do some pretty like hefty audits because they recognize that it's just not a game they've really played that much, and they want us to come in and give them a strong baseline from which they can build, and we can actually launch a content strategy. So that's one. Two, I'd say, is probably, actually building and delivering content that speaks directly to their clients, so stakeholders on the ground. So, like the Fair Shake example, like actually content that is going out to their audience and will help their audience. So almost content as a service, I would say, which is maybe a little bit different than
right. So it's kind of like a B2B to C kind of thing almost.
Right. Yeah. Well said. So there's that. And then, I'd say another interesting one is sort of this idea of like thought leadership for like individuals. So, for example, we're talking to like someone who, partly runs a foundation and wants to build their profile, in the space. Or, an organization that works in the South on like economic mobility issues and is looking to basically be the indispensable organization in the South on the matter. Like, that's a little bit different than, okay, we need so many, leads coming in the door and conversions and stuff. So we really try to dig into those high level goals and say like, okay, well, what does it mean to be the indispensable organization in the South from a content strategy perspective? So.
100%. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that really is a kind of a branding or like a positioning kind of strategy there. So,
mm-hmm. But you can also put numbers behind it too, right? Like, I mean, I think to some extent, like you're going to have, a strong amount of referring domains and backlinks, like if you are that indispensable, and you can sort of create the web of, all right, what does that actual network of organizations dealing with this look like? How does our organization through our content plug into them? Are we getting media mentions? Like you can put hard numbers to it, but it just takes a little bit more digging and focus there.
Yeah. All right, that's really interesting. So, do you find that there are any maybe specific strategy or tactics that we used at Optimist that don't apply to the work that you do with mission driven or nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that don't apply. I would say that maybe per my last point are in need of some tweaks. So I think maybe a focus on raw traffic, might not always be, and I know like in general for B2B SaaS, it's not, the best metric, but maybe even less so to some extent for some of these organizations, because it's a lot more about the quality and depth of the traffic than the overall traffic. So, you want that program officer at that foundation to, read your content and convert, which means like fund your organization, right? So that's like very specific. So you got to make sure that inside of that metric of traffic that, those program officers are living inside of that and then converting, right? So it's a bit more in the weeds, I'd say. So that's one big one. I'd say like the differences in the nature of the audiences and the way they consume content a little bit. So, for B2B SaaS, I think it's a bit more straightforward. For this, it's sort of like I think the funnel is maybe longer, in some cases, particularly for like a nonprofit that's trying to move someone from, I don't know anything about you to, I am now like a donor and an evangelist, so I think there's like a couple more steps there in terms of how we think about conversion, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like difficult, but not impossible to measure things like, thought leadership in the education research space, right? So I think like again, the numbers are there, but like sitting down with the client and drilling down to like what those numbers are behind that broad goal, I think is really important. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I think a lot that's kind of a big part of the job, right? It's just
mm-hmm.
translating the goal into the metrics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's in a lot of cases, I think that's a big reason why clients hire us ultimately, right? Is because
Mm-hmm.
they have this ambitious thing that they want to do, but they don't really know even how to measure it, let alone like how to actually execute it. So,
yep.
Yeah.
Paying you for your brain.
Right. Yeah. So I guess on the flip side of that, are there strategies or tactics that you kind of learned or use often on the kind of for-profit side, I guess, that you feel like have kind of sharpened or improved the effectiveness on the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that the general proposition that like if you invest yourselves a bit more in content strategy, that you can realize some big wins through that. I think that totally translates, and that's a big part of convincing folks at B2B SaaS to dig in and invest at certain stages of growth. I think the mission driven organizations that we work with, they really appreciate when we bring in metrics that are maybe traditionally situated in corporate or B2B SaaS that they haven't really thought about. They appreciate when we bring those in, and they, if we do it right, they see how they can really help their triple bottom line. So both in terms of bringing in funding or helping people or whatever the various metrics are. I think using data a bit more rigorously is a huge transferable one. Educating people about how you can track your analytics, using Google and sort of all the various things that Ahrefs and some of the other tools can do for you. They love that. And they're just like, wow, we didn't realize like this, we could track this. We didn't realize we should, so that's been really good. And then something as simple as like setting up and sticking to editorial calendars, like we meet a lot of organizations who have just been, we tried, we put out this post and then we did another one that month, and they just appreciate someone to run that for them, just like B2B SaaS does. And I'd say a more meta one is like, I guess not getting mired in like some of the interpersonal conflict that tends to happen. I think in nonprofit spaces, it can be a very like emotionally. There's a lot of vicarious emotional trauma in those spaces because you're dealing with like heavy stuff, like kids who are in jail or poverty or whatever your mission is. So I think helping organizations be ruthless for good in terms of their content strategy, I think is like a really important part. And I stole that line from Camelback Ventures, which is a great accelerator of social entrepreneurs, but helping them understand how they can be ruthless for good. Like, listen, we got to get this blog post out because it's going to help us bring in more donors. And if we have more donors, then we can help more people, and like, let's really do it. So stuff like that.
Oh, that's super interesting. I think that's like a very interesting space that we don't really get into. Is just sort of like that baseline of like operations and like education, I think, in terms of like marketing and how this stuff works, and like here's how A connects to B. I think in our work, as most people come in the door knowing the basics of what we do and why we're doing it. And so we're sort of starting on second base, so to speak. So I think that's awesome that you're sort of able to start at the beginning with some of these organizations and kind of help them understand even just like the fundamentals of why we're doing the things that we're doing, and then how they can learn from sort of like I would say like sort of the cutting edge of like for-profit marketing and how that those skills and strategies and tactics are applicable to their work.
Yeah, I think there's also like, I mean, this is part of the reason why we formed Literal Humans, and I think there's just a huge market for it right now. I think that like when we say mission driven, like I think every brand today, particularly in the pandemic, like wants to be seen as good and helpful and mission driven. So that can be your tech company that has a digital wellness product, all the way to your nonprofit that is doing on the ground education empowerment in Kansas City, for example. So I think there's and many of those organizations haven't been thinking about content strategy in a thoughtful way and are open to it now because a lot of folks are sitting at home on the computer more so than before, and they can maybe gain more traction through it. So Not to give away the goat, but I think there's a huge market opportunity there. So that's why we're part of the reason we're doing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are you having conversations right now with organizations that are maybe looking to invest more heavily in like a digital presence because they can't do like in-person events or things like that?
In some cases, yeah. Yeah, I think those event budgets have to go somewhere. And I think investing in content makes a ton of sense, whether it's like a webinar, digital webinar, or just new content that you're going to put out to engage with people that you would have otherwise engaged with in person. So that's a part of it. It's also like just a bigger business strategy shift, I think, that's happening in terms of, hey, a lot of this stuff used to happen at conferences or whatever kind of get-togethers, and now it has to happen differently. And one of the legs of that stool is going to be content.
Mm-hmm. I think an interesting trend here that we're going to see play out in slightly different ways on both sides is that, to that point exactly right, like a lot of companies, for-profit, mission-driven, nonprofit, are shifting budgets from in-person events, et cetera, to digital. And so we're seeing more content. And I think it's going to sort of raise the bar, in terms of the quality of content and how you're really engaging with folks. So I can imagine that, if I'm a nonprofit right now and I'm shifting a bunch of budget from events to say, like doing an email like an online campaign or like whatever, whatever that is, like I'm not the only organization making that play right now. Right. And so that means that as a consumer, I'm getting more emails asking for the same thing. And so you really, to get my attention, you really got to kind of stand above the other organizations, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny you mentioned email, because that's one of the things we're looking at in terms of like launching, more of a email newsletter niche, or studios, we're calling it that, because it's getting saturated. So, you can do it really well, and email is an incredible channel, as we know. So, and that's it. It's just a huge channel for nonprofits in particular in terms of fundraising. So if we can figure out how to do that really well, then, there's a ton to be gained there.
Yeah. That's super interesting. I think, yeah, that's definitely it's like a dark art to me. It's like something that I know people that like do it well, and that's like amazing, but like I feel very, very novice when it comes to like figuring out email strategy. So.
Yeah, it's heavy. I mean, you're hitting like 10,000 people's inboxes. Like you better be on your game. Like it's just, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
for sure. That's awesome. So maybe that's actually a good segue to my next question, which is like, going back to the question of like scope or maybe like the goals that an organization might come to you with. Is there anything that you feel like at this point is kind of like outside of your scope of work, or something that you maybe wouldn't feel like you wouldn't be able to help like a nonprofit achieve X?
Yeah, I think some of the internal communications and I should say like organizational politics. I used to be a social impact consultant, whatever the hell that term means. Like, and it just like it's intense work, and so it gives me a little PTSD when I think about getting involved in that again. But I think sometimes folks think that if you're like a marketing person or a communications person, that you can help with like how people are communicating internally, and that's not quite what I want to get involved in. So, for nothing else, because I've been there before and done that. So, I would say some like on the ground community-based work that frankly just still needs to be done face to face or mass to mass, as we should say. That's tricky. And I think sometimes folks want to bring in a marketing presence to like help with that. And some of that stuff is just irreplaceable in terms of building relationships on a human level. And then related to that, I would say like highly localized stuff, like super, you need to know on the ground, Tucson, Arizona, and market to that. Like, as you know, from our work, like that can be really tough. Try to stay away from that.
That makes sense. Cool. Well, how about with respect to kind of I guess like the business side of your company, and like, what can you tell us about kind of pricing, scoping, et cetera, and maybe how that varies from work that your experience with Optimist or past work with other types of clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely have to be, as I mentioned earlier, like a bit more flexible with, I think pricing can skew a little bit lower depending on the organization, but doesn't necessarily have to, I would say. And then the way that the spend happens can be a little bit different and wonky. So an example might be, we might do a quarter long pilot, and ramp up with an organization in which we're doing a really deep audit, like the one I mentioned earlier. And maybe that's connected to, they have to spend down that grant money by the end of the year. So they want to, spend out that audit money, do an audit to close out 2020, and then launch into a content strategy in 2021. So I think that's like kind of a good example. And I should say that audit will be the rationale for your budget as a content strategy vendor in the next year. So you better do a damn good job of it. And frankly, set yourself up, for, okay, here's your quarterly content calendar for 2020, Q1 2021. Cool. Oh, you want us to do that? Great. So that's kind of the slick stuff there. I would say in some cases, investing a bit more, we've seen this early, is investing a bit more in digital PR, because there's just like maybe not a function for it within the organization, or it's just completely lacking in some cases. So we found that we need to like push a little bit more on the promo side of things, different from maybe like a tech company that's like already in TechCrunch, or, it's got its thing up on Product Hunt, that there's not as much traction there, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes lower overall retainers, but I think you can, as an agency, you can be rigorous with yourself about that, and not, going so low that you're just taking things because, you want the business, but saying, okay, this is what we do, and this is our price for it, our value for it. Yeah.
That's actually a super interesting point. So like, do you, I think part of the reason I think most people would be interested in getting into working with, a mission-driven organization or a nonprofit is like, because they feel strongly about the cause or the message or the brand. And so like, do you find yourself ever like wrestling with that versus sort of the business economic side of it?
Yeah, in a way, like, yes, but I think I'm also kind of, and I don't mean this to sound like a weird, like, pat myself on the back thing, but like, I'm kind of the perfect person because I've been on the other side and done the budgets, and I like, nonprofits have money, and like we've talked to nonprofits, like they just don't always spend it that efficiently. And that's nothing to say about the private sector, which is wildly inefficient in so many ways. Like, talk to your local airline, cable company, phone company, whatever. So there's that. So I know they have money because I've created the budgets, I've spent the budgets before. So homie, don't play that, right? So that's part of it. And then, yeah, I think it's also about like communicating the value. So, they have a budget to spend down, and how your work aligns with that in terms of its value. So you just ask, and if they can't meet it, then you kick the conversation down the road. We've also had clients that can write us into funding lines, whether they're going for VC funding or, foundation funding. So that's another way to look at it too. It's like, oh, you don't have that money now, but you recognize the value of it and you're going to go pitch for it. Great. Write us into that line item. So
are there, so you're mentioning a lot of like interesting triggers that I think don't, apply really in our world, right? So like in our world, usually, the trigger for a new client is like they raised a Series C or like whatever, which I guess is analogous to, they got a grant or something like that in kind of the nonprofit world. Like, are there strategies or things that you're doing to kind of identify those opportunities? Or like, how do you kind of find people who are in those scenarios where they've got money that they need to spend by the end of the year or something like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the ways and one of the things we're looking at is, scanning the universe and doing a bit of a landscape analysis of VCs that are funding tech for good, in the broadest sense. So you can track that stuff just the same way you would track, your typical Series A on the normal for-profit side. And then you can also look at foundation allocations as well. That tends to be public information, so you can see. And a lot of times they'll do press releases. So cool. Ford Foundation just gave this organization in Miami a bunch of money. Chase it down, follow the money. So that, it sounds a little icky, but that's a moment when they're thinking, okay, we have these funds. How do we tell this story, about the funding that we just got and the program we're implementing?
They raise that money for a reason, right? Like, not just to have it. So
yeah. And a lot of times they're going to hire like a content manager, or that there's, a content or comms person in that organization. So our first client came through, a connection of mine who posted on LinkedIn that they were hiring a content manager, and I was like, nope, hire us instead, and boom, so that's another channel as well, just having understanding of your network and engaging it. So
for sure, yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so I want to close out here. We're kind of in the home stretch here, the last 10 minutes or so. I want to help maybe provide some thoughts or some tips for folks who maybe want to move in this direction, professionally. So, if I'm a writer, or I'm a content strategist, or I'm somebody who maybe works primarily with for-profit companies, startups, e-commerce, whatever it is, but I want to move more in this direction, say mission-driven broadly or nonprofit specifically, what maybe tips or advice would you give me to kind of help me start to make that move, or what should I do first?
Yeah, I would say not terribly dissimilar from the B2B SaaS space. Like, it helps to have a bit of a niche and some subject matter expertise. So I think in my case, I think having being pretty well versed in education has, it helped us with a couple of clients at Optimist in different ways in terms of getting, publications to respond to our requests, or just writing about specific clients, submittable as an example. So I think that in some cases can matter more in the mission-driven space, because their work is so specific to health or employment or education, for example. So I'd recommend niching down a little bit and starting to build some subject matter expertise. I'd recommend learning about how, and I'm actually going to write a post about this pretty soon, but how high performing and low performing content strategy works in the mission driven space, because I think there are some substantive differences and some similarities, of course. And then I'd say just talk to people in that space who are content managers at different nonprofits and mission driven brands. And I think sometimes that's the best, most it's such an accelerant of your learning. It's just like downloading someone's brain for half an hour, offer them a coffee, yeah. So.
Yeah, that's actually, that was my next question, was what I guess maybe tactically, what have you found is kind of the best way to maybe build those relationships or get an in with a particular person at an organization? Yeah,
those conversations, volunteer. I'm on the board of a nonprofit, which is another thing I'd recommend. Serve on a board, and offer your services as a content marketer. Maybe low bono, pro bono. Well, you'd have to do it pro bono if you're on the board, just legally. But yeah, and I've been able to advise executive directors on how to do content strategy a bit smarter than maybe your average nonprofit does, which has been really cool. Schedule that information session or that chat with, someone who's doing content marketing in the space, and download their brain a bit. But yeah, I think the volunteering thing is really interesting, because you can, you do a blog post or two a month for a nonprofit that you really love, that can have a huge impact, because they're maybe going from 0 to 2, on a monthly basis. That's massive, and it's only a couple hours of your time. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. A lot of people, of course, talk about that idea of working for free to kind of get your foot in the door, but I think in that case, it's something that's sort of a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
Volunteering your time and advancing the organization, and then hopefully also getting your foot in the door a little bit.
Yeah, build a portfolio.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that point that you made too about kind of niching down, because I think that is, I think as somebody who comes from a space outside of the nonprofit world, what I see a lot, and I think the way that I often think, which is wrong, is that nonprofits is a vertical, but in reality, it's tons of different segments based on different missions and causes and different things like that. If you're thinking about that more granularly, it's just like any kind of marketing, right? The more kind of precise you can get in who you're talking to, whether it's animal focused organizations versus hunger or poverty or homelessness or whatever, and kind of building that specific niche is I'm assuming super powerful.
Yeah, another thought too, and this has helped me, is it's kind of a weird tactical piece of advice, but become a freelance journalist in the space that you care about, right? That helped me a ton in terms of I worked for Inside Philanthropy, and I got to scan the entire universe of, foundations and philanthropies funding education, K-12 in the United States specifically, which really helped me when came time to write for Submittable, because that's their clientele. They want to convince program officers to use Submittable to, for submissions and things like that. So I, in my brain, because I did all that journalistic work, had a sense of that space, so there's tons of publications out there that could use your writing skills, and are willing to let you learn up, to do that.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe this kind of final question here, I think maybe you just kind of answered it, but one of the things that I think a lot about in this space, and as somebody who might want to kind of move in this direction, in all spaces, I think there's the sense of like imposter syndrome, where you think like, oh, I don't know if my work is like good enough or if it's gonna like make a big difference, and I think that's maybe amplified when you're thinking about like a mission-driven organization, or especially a nonprofit. You're thinking to yourself like, these guys have a very limited budget. They don't have, they can't waste resources on me. So like, how do I know if I'm gonna be able to deliver results for them? Do you have any thoughts on maybe how people can kind of grapple with that, or again, maybe specific steps to kind of prove to themselves in a way that they can provide value?
Yeah. I think, the imposter syndrome thing is real. I think in some cases, like it's a bit misplaced, because you can do a ton of, you can create a ton of value for these organizations, right? So I think focus on the outcomes that you want to help, the org achieve, and maybe even have like a dashboard for yourself. Like, here's some things that you want to do from an output perspective that, that matter. And if that's like, again, the 2 blog posts a month as a volunteer for that nonprofit, like that's huge, that's big. But also look at the outcomes in terms of, are you helping them bring in more donors? Are you driving traffic to their site? Are you, helping them get media mentions in various, important publications for the org? And then I'd say like, be rigorous with that, because that's what you're bringing to the table. You're bringing a data-driven focus. You're bringing, an output, focus and outcome focused perspective that maybe is missing from the org. Don't assume it's missing, because I think a lot of times it's not. And then, definitely try to minimize. I mean, when we were working with nonprofits at Optimist, like try to minimize the time you're spending pulling folks away from their core work. Right? Because, every hour you take away from them is maybe time that they're not spending directly serving people or raising money, So when you send that email, make sure it's thorough. When you ping someone, make sure that that's the only time maybe you need to ping them that day or that week, so you can get all the information you need to go do your work. Be a little bit more, economical with how you consume their time, and maximize what you deliver for them. So, and I think bring in the parts of your expertise that clearly add value. So if that's helping them look at the data a little bit more rigorously, if that's just producing on a more regular basis, be upfront about, what you're bringing to the table and bring it.
Yeah, I think that hits on a really salient point, which I think applies to anyone who's kind of providing services in this space or doing marketing, is the value that people create, they often undervalue themselves, right? They think like, I'm only providing value if my blog post goes viral and gets 1 million signups, like whatever. But really, even just at the most fundamental level, like you're saying, like allowing somebody 5 extra hours a week to focus on something more important, like that's a lot of value, like that you can add just by doing the work, even if you can't connect it to something bigger than that.
Yeah, I think the execution piece is like critical. I think one, it's not really a critique, but it's like I've experienced it, is like I think sometimes in education I've seen this, in nonprofits, like great at strategic plans, great at sort of the big picture thinking, and then struggle a little bit with the execution. And sometimes that's because of scarcity of resources. Things are happening with the people that you're serving that are dire. People are being hurt, or they're struggling, and so there's real reasons behind that. But as someone who's stepping into that space, that's something you can help with. And I think recognizing that is something that weighs on the people you're working with, that like, yeah, we set that in our strategic plan and we've done nothing about it, and we could really use help to do it. Like, to me, that's the key. You plug in right there where the need is. So
yeah. So I think a good kind of takeaway there is just expand your thinking about the value that you're able to provide, right? And kind of try to think about the full range of value if you have any trepidation about your work or being able to deliver impact or whatever it is. Even just being an extra hand can provide a ton of value, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are so grateful. You know what I mean? I think that's a big thing. We recognize that when we were working with nonprofits at Optimist, and we see that with our core clients here. They're just grateful, you know, and that's a cool feeling and an emotion to like wash yourself in on a regular basis, is like, man, I get to help these young, you know, social entrepreneurs of color, or, you know, these, you know, kids get educated. Like, that's pretty awesome. So
Great. Cool. Well, we're at the top of our hour here. I just want to say, again, Paul, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I think tons of awesome insights and ideas and tips, and excited to see kind of how you continue to grow your own thing and all that. Real quick, do you have kind of a plug or something that you want to share with folks who might be watching?
Yeah, I mean, you can check us out at literalhumans.com, and we're just getting rolling here. We've got our first few clients on board, and we're excited. We're building a really strong team. But yeah, grateful for the time and the conversation as always. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome, cool. Thanks again, Paul.
Yeah.
Quick final reminder, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel here for more awesome content like this, and check out our community, top of the funnel, at yesoptimist.com/tofu, TOFU. All right, everyone, that's a wrap for today. Thanks all for attending, and thanks again, Paul, for joining us today. Super interesting conversation, and glad we got to connect.
You bet. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers.
See ya.